Good afternoon, and welcome to a virtual lecture brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. My name is Clement Sedmark, and I'm the interim director of this institute. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome our speaker, Dr. Mark Kettler. Dr. Mark Kettler is a postdoctoral research associate of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and he has been in this role since 2018. Mark is a historian of modern Europe, specifically a historian of Germany and Eastern Europe, who studies imperialism and colonialism to analyze larger questions of national identity and relationship of ethnic minorities to the modern state. Before coming to the Nanovic Institute, he received his PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley in 2018. As an undergraduate student, Mark was here with us at the University of Notre Dame, and he was a very successful undergraduate. He obtained his BA in History and Political Science, magna cum laude, in 2012. He was awarded the Stephen and Ruth Barrett Family Grant for Best Research Proposal, awarded for German national defense politics and Catholics in the Second Reich through the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. And he was also awarded the Senior Thesis Prize through the University of Notre Dame for his thesis entitled In Steadfast Loyalty, Bavarian Nationalism and Imperial Allegiance in the Second Reich. His research interests include modern Europe, Germany and Eastern Europe, ethnic conflict and genocide, nationalism, imperialism and colonialism, World Wars I and II, the Holocaust, authoritarianism and fascism, war in society, political and cultural history. From his publications, I would like to mention his essay, Designing Empire for a Civilized East, Colonialism, Polish Nationhood and German War Aims in the First World War, which was published in Nationalities paper 47 in 2019, and was awarded the Huttenbach Prize for the best article published in that journal in that year. We are very pleased to have Mark with us. He's a beloved teacher and has a great sense of humor. And we need this kind of humor when we talk about serious topics like the one that his lecture will be dedicated to. Mark will give us a lecture on the Christ of Empires, German veneration of Austria-Hungary in the First World War. And I keep saying that I'm from Austria, and this was not my idea that Mark would choose this topic. He will discuss how many influential German imperialists understood the Austro-Hungarian Empire with its multinationalism as a model to be followed. They imagined a post-war European future with reinvigorated multinational empires. Mark will present his lecture for about 25 to 30 minutes. Afterwards, we have Q&A. And I would ask you to please make use of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen that we can get the discussion going. Mark, welcome. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Clemens, for that really generous introduction. Bear with me for a moment as I bring up my slideshow and share my screen. There, can everybody see that?
Yes,
all
we
right,
can see that.
I'll assume that you can. So on the 28th of June, 1914, Gavrilo Princip famously shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo. Princip justified the murder as necessary to liberate the oppressed South Slavic peoples, the Yugoslav nation, from the Habsburg Empire. Vienna's insistence that neighboring Serbia cease sponsorship of Greater Serbian nationalism or Yugoslav nationalism and grant Austria-Hungary invasive authority to dismantle these circles famously sparked the First World War. But even as Europe lurched toward war, some German writers described the assassination in redemptive terms. Hans Delbrück, a Berlin historian and editor of the influential journal Preußische Jahrbücher, wrote, "What his resolve can no longer give to Austria, his death will. Like the blood of the martyrs once formed the mortar of the stones of the church, so will the blood of the successor to the throne and his spouse, brought to the Habsburg monarchy as an offering, stoke deeds that far supersede what the living could have accomplished." His protege, the influential foreign policy writer Paul Rohrbach, similarly portrayed Franz Ferdinand as a martyr whose death had revived what he called the Austro-Hungarian state idea in dramatic fashion. This metaphor, in fact, proved remarkably durable. In 1916, the psychologist and progressive politician Willy Helpach similarly portrayed Franz Ferdinand as a messianic figure whose assassination absolved the dual monarchy of ethnic tension as its constituent nations rose in indignation to defend their common state from the chaos of nationalist strife. Consciously or not, this rhetoric mirrored Polish Romanticism's tradition of national messianism. Adam Mickiewicz authored the most influential rendition of this trope in 1830. In the beginning, Mickiewicz wrote, there was freedom on earth, and there were no masters or slaves. But this ideal world fell into tyranny and exploitation. Only Poland stood apart, a noble republic promising equality and freedom. Threatened by Poland's virtue, Mickiewicz speculated, a coalition of tyrants had partitioned, destroyed, crucified this commonwealth. But Mickiewicz held out hope, predicting that Poland would, quote, rise again and free all of the peoples of Europe from slavery. Poland thus became an innocent sacrifice whose death unmasked the corruption of European politics and whose resurrection would inaugurate a new era of justice and freedom. National messianism reflected expectations that were broadly shared by radical European nationalists, that only national sovereignty could dismantle tyranny. From the early months of the First World War, German publicists inverted this discourse. Just as national messianism enabled nationalists to define their particular aims in universal humanitarian terms, imperial messianic images of Franz Ferdinand became a metaphor by which German writers could articulate their own visions of a more just, a more humane, and fraternal future. They reframed Franz Ferdinand as an innocent sacrifice whose death revealed the potentially monstrous violence of nationalism and reinforced the transnational solidarities which held the empire together. They wrote him, in short, as a Christ of empires. Historians continue to debate nationalist politics in the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire. Most scholars, however, generally accept that German contemporaries dismissed the dual monarchy as a dysfunctional and an anachronistic structure, even as a foil to the supposedly homogeneous and united German nation state. And certainly this sentiment was common enough, right? Members of the Ostmarkenverein, which was an association dedicated to Germanizing the Polish-speaking regions of Eastern Prussia, they were predictably venomous toward Austria-Hungary, claiming that many national communities in the empire generated diverging political interest, what they called a centrifugal power, tearing the monarchy apart. This portrait of Austria-Hungary as a sclerotic, anachronistic, and doomed edifice, it did quite a bit of political work for these German nationalists. Believing that national identity determined political loyalty, they caricatured Austro-Hungarian politics to argue for the necessity of a nationally homogeneous German empire, purified of minorities who might introduce diverging interest, disunity, and dysfunction into imperial politics. But this was only one variant or one German portrait of the dual monarchy. Before and during the First World War, some of Germany's most influential political thinkers, in fact, praised the Austro-Hungarian Empire for successfully mobilizing and harmonizing the interests of multiple nationalist constituencies. Its mobilization of ethnically diverse populations for service in the First World War reinforced German confidence that national diversity could be compatible with a cohesive, stable, and functioning state. Moreover, some regarded Austria-Hungary as an inspiration for how the German Empire should organize its own future, and indeed the future of Eastern Europe, imagining the reconstruction of Germany as an explicitly multinational empire, which could harmonize diversity and defend pluralism from the violent storms of nationalist conflict and homogenizing empires. Austria-Hungary thus functioned as inspiration for a peaceful, prosperous, and nationally diverse Central Europe under German leadership. The Austro-Hungarian military faced severe material shortages in 1914. Military spending had long lagged behind other European powers, and in 1914, Austria-Hungary could therefore mobilize only 48 infantry divisions against Russia's 93 and Serbia's 11. Contemporary observers feared as well that nationalism would undermine military performance. For every 1,000 soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army, there were 267 Germans, 233 Magyars, 135 Czechs, 85 Poles, 81 Ruthenians, 67 Croats and Serbs, 64 Romanians, 38 Slovaks, 26 Slovenes, and 14 Italians. This raised concerns of battlefield miscommunication, but many also worried that in a crisis, soldiers would prioritize their national identity and interests over duty to the empire. Austria-Hungary, however, proved remarkably solid in the event. Its multi-ethnic composition, to all appearances, did not cripple the army. Aside from scattered anti-war protests in Bohemia, mobilization occurred largely without disruption. The first weeks of the war saw effusive declarations of imperial patriotism from the empire's Czechs and Serbs. Austria-Hungary's multi-ethnic armies endured staggering losses and dramatic setbacks without cracking. Despite grievous defeats in the Carpathians and Serbia, the Habsburg armies cohered and continued to mobilize millions through the early years of the war. Austrian intellectuals deliberately emphasized what they called an Austrian miracle of transnational imperial loyalism. We should be aware that this was an artifact of propaganda. The legitimacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire certainly facilitated mobilization in many circumstances. At the same time, some of these demonstrations of imperial patriotism were organized by local officials. Censorship routinely excluded anti-imperial dissent. As in all wartime societies, failure to report for conscription carried serious legal penalties. Nonetheless, influential German intellectuals and politicians reproduced this rhetoric of an Austrian miracle, interpreting the apparent durability of the monarchy as proof of its robust legitimacy among its non-German populations. Following the Sarajevo assassination, Hans Delbrück estimated that most Croats and Bosnians remained loyal Habsburg subjects, and that greater Serbian nationalism had only won a few converts. Austria-Hungary's wartime solidity deeply impressed Friedrich Naumann, a prominent left liberal politician, who complimented Vienna on its smooth mobilization and admirable loyalty of its Slavic populations in the face of war with Russia and Serbia, two neighboring Slavic powers. In late August 1914, the historian Friedrich Meinecke praised the Austrian people's, quote, unanimous will to defend their multinational state. I'll quote at length. These days have shown that the uniting powers inside Austria are stronger than the dissolving. Austria's peoples want to remain together. They don't want to let their old secular state and cultural association be destroyed. Far from a collapsing relic of a bygone era, some of Germany's most influential political minds read the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a durable political organization capable of inspiring loyalty and even sacrifice from a staggering variety of ethnic communities. Many believed that war had reinvigorated Austria-Hungary, uniting its peoples, quote, without distinction of nation in enthusiastic defense of the state. Naumann suggested that existential threat had suppressed minor, what he called tensions and national ruptures, and convinced Austrians to take up arms for Kaiser and Fatherland. One observer noted his pleasant astonishment in seeing how Austria's, quote, national oppositions have disappeared at once, how in Bohemia, Germans and Czechs forget their bitter disputes, the men hurried pugnaciously to the standards, and the population unanimously remembered the cultural blessings that they had long enjoyed under the mild scepter of Franz Joseph. Meinecke indeed argued that the war had transformed the dual monarchy, forging Austria-Hungary as what he called a state nation, which united Germans, Czechs, Magyars, etc., in defense of an imperial structure which achieved common prosperity and security while allowing each nation to develop its own particular cultures. For many German thinkers, Austria-Hungary's early war experience offered a clear lesson. Multinational states could mobilize robust popular support to confront external threats. Indeed, prominent Germans cited Austria-Hungary to argue that protecting national diversity and permitting ethnic communities the right to develop their own culture had actually fortified the state's political cohesion. In May 1915, the editorial board of Das Größere Deutschland conspicuously praised Austria-Hungary's, quote, historical mission to be the refuge and shield to all of the small nations and pieces of nations of Habsburg Central Europe. Vienna's willingness to tolerate and defend national particularism to support the continued cultivation of national cultures, the board concluded, constituted a robust source of legitimacy in the eyes of Habsburg subjects. It created an identity of interests between the empire and its constituent nations, based on nationalists' recognition that membership in the empire preserved them from predatory powers like Russia, which would be perhaps more inclined to aggressively Russify populations that came under their dominion. Meinecke similarly believed that Vienna's avoidance of national homogenization and performative commitment to cultural pluralism had reinforced the empire. The constituent nations of Austria-Hungary, he suggested, realized that the empire did not endanger their own culture, but rather afforded them, quote, greater security, freedom of development, and political power than an alternative existence as independent, quote, dwarf states ever could. Austria-Hungary was not, in his eyes, a prison of nations, but a greenhouse, sheltering saplings from the wintry winds of European realpolitik. The Habsburg monarchy's protection of national diversity, Helpach similarly argued, bound its various peoples to the imperial state by affording them a degree of cultural freedom and military security which they would be unable to sustain on their own. Now, none of this is terribly surprising, or at least it shouldn't be. Austrian conservatives and even social democratic intellectuals had long justified the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a multi-ethnic shelter. In this respect, German observers echoed existing Austro-Hungarian political discourses. But German debates about Habsburg durability proxied larger arguments about national identity and the future of the German Empire in post-war Europe. That is, German thinkers marshaled interpretations of the Austro-Hungarian political system to articulate their own positions on how the German Empire should manage ethnic diversity at home. German perceptions of Austria-Hungary were closely interwoven with wartime debates over how an expanded German Empire would govern the populations of conquered territories in Eastern Europe. Imperialists across the political spectrum agreed that Germany's future security depended upon seizing territory from the Russian Empire, especially in Russian Poland, or what was called Congress Poland. The question of how to pacify and manage these territories, however, engendered significant debate, with nationalist pressure groups like the Pan-German League or Ostmarkenverein routinely and vigorously promoting programs of annexation and Germanization. Austrophile intellectuals, however, lauded Austria-Hungary as an ideal of imperial organization which Germany could and should emulate. They rejected proposals for Germanizing conquests, arguing that the Habsburg monarchy had demonstrated the significant strategic advantages of embracing multinationalism as an approach to managing imperial space. They insisted that German imperial interests could be reconciled, even harmonized, with the interests of Polish and other Eastern European nationalists. When contemplating German imperial expansion, thinkers like Naumann thus argued that Berlin must abandon its long-standing efforts to Germanize its own Polish-speaking population and learn from Austria-Hungary's more tolerant and successful strategy of ethnic management. The historian Ignaz Jastrov agreed. He urged Berlin to learn from Vienna's long experience in managing ethnic diversity to govern new territory in Russian Poland and Eastern Europe. An expanded German empire, he insisted, must emulate Austria-Hungary's, quote, capacity to discover, appreciate, and come to terms with many nationalities, and especially its tolerant and collaborative approach to managing ethnic diversity. Some went further. Helpach interpreted Austria-Hungary as expressing a core national virtue, what he called a second face of the German essence, namely a respect for cultural pluralism or cosmopolitanism. The, quote, intrinsic value of the Germans for the world, what one might call a national mission, lay not in a particular cultural achievement, but rather in Germany's, quote, cosmopolitan feeling. Germany, Helpach argued, could only fulfill its divinely appointed mission in the world by imitating Austria-Hungary, by constructing durable systems which harmonized political unity with cultural plurality, which preserved national diversity and sustained conditions in which national traditions could flourish. The German Empire could not Germanize Eastern Europe, Helpach insisted. It should instead construct something like a, quote, Austria on the grandest scale, embracing a multinational mission and using its military and political strength to organize and protect the small nations of Eastern Europe from Russian expansionism. Austria-Hungary represented such a compelling model to Helpach because it offered a path by which Germany could achieve its most urgent strategic goals, even as it promised the small nations of Eastern Europe refuge to practice and develop their culture, to continue to contribute their own unique ideas and innovations in a rapidly homogenizing world. Thinkers like Delbruck, Rohrbach, and Meinecke sympathized with this view. Surveying the contemporary world, Delbruck and Rohrbach both lamented that human culture was being impoverished by the relentless march of Russification and Russian imperial expansion, by English colonial norms, and by American capitalism, all of which they believed threatened to erode or eliminate what they call, or the quote, diversity of nations, which they believed was so necessary for human cultural productivity. They too decried Prussia's own Germanization policies as contrary to the essential spirit of the German nation, and similarly called upon Berlin to configure imperial expansion to serve Germany's historic mission of salvaging and protecting the nations of Eastern Europe within a common multinational structure. Meinecke cited Austria-Hungary's capacity to inspire loyalty from a panoply of national traditions to demonstrate his central contention that the future of European political life lay in the construction of multinational confederations, rather than in the parcelation of multi-ethnic communities into homogeneous nation-states. With prophetic clarity, Meinecke warned that if nationalists did not abandon the idea of, quote, absolute and ruthless unity of nation and state, and if imperial states did not learn to practice tolerance for the foreign nations within their borders, Europe would be plagued by fractious conflict for generations. A multinational empire under Germany's protection would offer refuge from both threats. Now, German admirers of Austria-Hungary almost unanimously insisted that the Habsburg monarchy required fundamental and thoroughgoing constitutional reform. They sneered at the dysfunctionality of the empire's fiscal military system, dependent as it was upon decennial budget negotiations, which gave the empire's Hungarian nobility an outsized role in shaping imperial policy. Naumann and Delbruck also faulted the Ausgleich of 1867, the settlement which had effectively partitioned the Austrian Empire into two largely autonomous halves, the Kingdom of Hungary and the lands directly administered by Vienna. They faulted this for unwittingly encouraging the Hungarian nobility to launch their own destabilizing program of national homogenization or Magyarization. Sympathetic German intellectuals celebrated Austria-Hungary as an inspiration for Germany's multinational future, but warned Germany to improve upon the organizational particulars of this model. Specifically, they imagined pairing the Austrian ethos with German constitutional innovations. Namely, they urged Vienna to mimic the federalist structure of the German Empire, to decentralize virtually all competences of governance to a patchwork of autonomous states, reserving only military affairs, foreign policy, and a few commercial regulatory powers to the imperial state. Federalization, they argued, would assuage nationalists who desired control over cultural institutions and systems of local governance, and simultaneously rationalize the empire's fiscal military structure. Writing in 1900, Naumann thus recommended restructuring the dual monarchy as a, quote, multinational federal state composed of autonomous national territories of self-administration, which he thought should be drawn roughly according to ethnic lines. These would have broad authority over their own linguistic, educational, and cultural affairs, but would be limited by common regulations protecting national minorities. Meinecke likewise hoped that Austria-Hungary would use the war as an opportunity to reform itself into a, quote, peaceful federation of free, satisfied nationalities. Writing in the wake of the Sarajevo assassination, Rohrbach insisted that federalization would undercut even Yugoslav or Greater Serbian nationalist movement by fulfilling most of the demands that had inspired support for this movement, that had inspired supporters for this movement. Indeed, German federalism, Rohrbach believed, even offered a political format for Austro-Hungarian expansion into the Balkans. The Kingdom of Serbia, he predicted optimistically in July 1914, could easily be incorporated into an Austro-Federalist structure, permitted to govern itself as an autonomous component of the Habsburg Empire. German perceptions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the First World War were far more varied than typically imagined. Influential German writers interpreted Austria-Hungary's remarkable durability as proof that empires could be both nationally diverse, politically durable, and accepted as legitimate by their populations. Indeed, many held up the dual monarchy as an inspiration for an expanded German empire, one which would be multinational, federal, and committed to cultural pluralism. This translated into a whole range of multinational imperial proposals. Naumann, Helpach, Jastrov, and Jake encouraged the German Empire to unite in permanent military and political union with Austria-Hungary, as well as new states carved from the Russian Empire, building a grand Central European Confederation, or Mitteleuropa, under German leadership. Meinecke, Delbruck, and Rohrbach, on the other hand, espoused a more restrained vision, eschewing any formal connection with Austria-Hungary and recommending instead that Germany focus its attention on binding a new autonomous Polish state in permanent military and political union with the German Empire. Both of these variants, however, relied on a similar formula. German leadership in military affairs and foreign policy would safeguard the collaboration of autonomous constituent nations, as well as their cultural and political self-governance. Austrophile writers were not marginal figures by any stretch of the imagination. Meinecke had already attained wide acclaim as a historian. Naumann's weekly political journal, Die Hilfe, circulated widely, and his 1915 book, Mitteleuropa, virtually defined German war aims discourse through 1918. Delbruck edited Preußische Jahrbucher, perhaps the most influential political journal of the era. Rohrbach was widely regarded as one of the most widely read commentators on German colonial and foreign policy. Austrophiles also wielded considerable influence in political and government circles. Aside from their leading positions in the Progressive People's Party and Catholic Center Party, parties that were both necessary for the government in Berlin to create a political majority in the Reich, or a legislative majority in the Reichstag, these intellectuals submitted numerous memoranda to the imperial government, Rohrbach also coordinated the Russian working group within Germany's wartime propaganda bureau, the Zentralstelle für Auslandsdienst, and consulted on a regular basis with the Foreign Office and the Chancellery in this capacity. Perhaps the truest measure of their influence, however, is that Berlin opted to embrace these proposals for a multinational German-Polish Union as its principal war aim in Eastern Europe in the spring of 1916. And indeed, Germany and Austria-Hungary declared the creation of an autonomous Polish kingdom in November of 1916 for exactly this reason, to bring it into union with the German Empire. That prominent elites saw the dual monarchy as inspiration for Germany's future, and that Berlin's policymakers followed their prescriptions challenges the long-standing idea that Germany entered the war determined to violently Germanize vast swaths of conquered Polish territory. It also allows us to break apart staid assumptions about how Germans interpreted the war and recognize the multiple, highly contested discourses of nation and empire that vied for supremacy in German politics. Now, cursory treatments of wartime culture love to quote Werner Sombart's Händler und Helden to argue that German intellectuals tended to imagine the war as an existential struggle between a mechanistic Western civilization or civilization and a more authentic, deeper German Kultur. These readings pair comfortably with narratives of German nationalism as deeply and persistently pathological. They interpret Germany's First World War as a chauvinist crusade in which Germans understood their national art and culture as vastly superior to those of Western and Eastern nations. But German Austrophiles advanced an alternative framework for interpreting the war. They insisted that Germany's wartime mission was to defend national diversity, which they understood as a positive good, a dynamo of cultural productivity and progress. More specifically, they saw Germany as a guardian of the principle of multinational empire, standing against nationalists and nationalizing states who sought to either violently parcel Europe into a pastiche of nation states or destroy nations in the path of their expansion. Austrophilia confirms that influential German elites in 1914 understood multinational empire as a plausible approach for addressing the nationalist forces associated with political modernity. The acceptance of the nation state as the only conceivable framework for mastering modern political forces was not inevitable, but rather the contingent outcome of the First World War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is the virtual applause. Thank you so much. By the second, you made the 30 minutes, impressive time management, rich in content. Dear members of the audience, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A button. I will start us off with a question as a semi-patriot. I grew up in Austria, specifically in Bad Ischl, which, as you know, is the place where the emperor had his summer residence and spent about 80 summers of his life in Bad Ischl. There are many monarchists in Bad Ischl thinking about the wonderful times that they had under Emperor Franz Joseph. And I heard many discussions about the successes or failures of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then I read John Rawls's remarks about the cage of peoples, where he's very critical of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And since you know the literature so well, Mark, I wonder, what's the current reading of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Is there any reason to be jealous of it or venerate it as you describe it from the German perspective?
The question, I suppose I'll respond by saying it depends on when you're asking about, right? Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire changes very dramatically. And one of the idiosyncratic things about this is even as German intellectuals are coming around to endorsing the idea of multinational, multi-ethnic empire within Austria during the First World War, Austria-Hungary is having an increasingly problematic relationship with this, right? They oversee a brutally violent occupation of Serbia, which includes numerous massacres, and the wartime management of domestic opinion and dissent is also increasingly coercive. Pre-war is likewise a complicated question. Until about a month ago, I would say that the literature was trending indisputably in one direction, which was that Austria-Hungary was actually relatively durable, was capable of absorbing and managing ethnic conflict and kind of finding political solutions to questions of national resource allocation. Certainly there's a lot of good evidence that the various populations of Austria-Hungary very often understood it in these terms, right, as a perfectly suitable home that they were very comfortable living under. And willing to serve and die for. One interesting statistic is that there's more South Slavic speakers who, you know what, I can't remember the statistic, so I won't quote it because I'm going to get it wrong. However, there's a countercurrent, right? Recently, John Connolly published a book that I'm still working my way through called From Peoples into Nations. And he's pushing back against this argument about this idea that the majority of the Austro-Hungarian populations were comfortable or were nationally indifferent or were fairly loyal to the Habsburg state. And he's making a much stronger case that nationalism was a force that the imperial state simply was not up to master. I tend to disagree with that. I tend to fall more on the side of these arguments of imperial loyalism and national indifference, but it is an argument that is very much alive.
Thanks a lot, Mark. We have the first 4 questions. Let's start with a very short one. Did the minority ethnicities in Austria-Hungary resent monarchy as a regime type?
It depends, right? And it's not necessarily along ethnic lines. There are social democrats in Austria-Hungary, there are Democrats in Austria-Hungary, there are conservatives and monarchists in Austria-Hungary, and they cut across ethnic lines. So monarchism is not the preserve of anyone in particular, right? You know, the Hungarian liberal nobility and middle class is very famously inclined towards monarchism, even if they sit uncomfortably with Habsburg authority and hegemony. Like everything in politics, it always depends on who you ask. Certainly some did resent monarchism, but it wasn't necessarily an ethnic or national issue.
Thank you. Very clear answer. Our own fellow and colleague Robert Norton has a slightly longer question. Mark, I enjoyed your lecture very much and largely agree with your thesis and conclusions. However, it was not only what you call German Austrophiles supported a pluralist, tolerant, cosmopolitan solution. Those were ideas that were also advanced by many others, foremost among them Ernst Troeltsch, who advanced his own very carefully articulated idea for a Central European bloc in his essay Die Ideen von 1914, as well as in his speech later published on Die Deutsche Idee von der Freiheit, which he held, as it happens, in Vienna in October 1915. You will be able to read all about this and many other things in my forthcoming book, The Crucible of German Democracy, Ernst Troeltsch and the First World War. Mark, any comments on Robert's comment/question?
Yeah, forgive me, I'm not sure if I heard a question, but I think it's a good comment and a good segue into noting that this is, I completely agree. This is part of a much larger project that I've been grappling with, which is actually about a phenomenon that I call multinational imperialism, that is attempting to grapple with how Germans during the First World War were approaching this question of imperial expansion and how to manage ethnic diversity. And Ernst Troeltsch certainly was one of these people who landed on a similar idea. Now, I don't tend to look at his work because, well, I don't include him as much in my analysis because he also had ideas about Russian barbarism that, in my mind, seem to exclude him from this larger milieu that is otherwise large in general agreement about the value of national diversity. But I'll put that aside. To Ernst Troeltsch, we could add any number of figures like Matthias Erzberger, Albrecht von Rechenberg, Kurt Riesler.
That's already three. That's a convincing argument.
The military is suffused with multinational imperialists. So these guys are spread all throughout the political, intellectual, and military elite of the German Empire. And indeed, one of the things that I'm arguing is that when Germany marches to war in 1914, it's not this vision of conquering and Germanizing space that is at the forefront of how Germans are imagining a post-war Europe. It is in fact multinationalism, right? The preponderance of the most influential people, including the chancellor and the high command of the German army, are thinking in multinational terms. They're thinking in terms of restructuring Germany as a multinational empire. So I guess the short answer is I agree with you, right? There's lots of these guys. This is just kind of an interesting segue into it that is appropriate for a half-hour lecture.
I mean, maybe Robert's book will make you more favorable towards Ernst Troeltsch. We have a question by Aaron Jackson. This was a fascinating presentation, specifically on the topic of respecting and admiring the multinationalism of Austria. Would it be accurate to say that these Austrophiles that you have covered today represented a minority opinion in the German world of the time?
That's really hard to answer. We don't have any modern polling data, right? So it's really hard to parse apart who was saying what and who held what opinion. I am comfortable saying that this larger phenomenon of multinational imperialism held at least a plurality of German political opinion. It was espoused by some of the most influential political publicists of the day. So I'll couch my specific answer within that larger architecture. I would argue that probably a smaller number of Germans within this multinationalist plurality would have considered themselves admirers or Austrophiles. Now, that's not to say that the majority therefore were skeptical of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's that I can only say that there is this group that is deliberately espousing Austrophilia. However, that's an incredibly important group, right? As I mentioned, Hans Delbrück, the editor of one of the most influential political journals of the time, is an Austrophile. Friedrich Naumann, the editor of literally the best-selling political book of the war, is an Austrophile, and Austrophilia suffuses Mitteleuropa. It's all over there. And he edits Die Hilfe, which is a political journal which has a circulation of 100,000, just a massive number at the time. And that's just bought copies, right? Remember, reading practices at the time means that after you finish a paper, you pass it off to like 2 or 3 people. So we can't say with any certainty how widespread these ideas were, but it would be wrong to say that it's a vanishing minority of rarefied German intellectuals. These weren't fringe figures.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. John Dayek. His question, Jan Vermeuren's book, the book First World War and German National Identity. This book argues, if I remember correctly, that the Austrophilia among German publicists did not have much, if any, effect in German policy and military policy. What is your take here?
Yeah, I've read Jan Vermeuren's book. I really like it. So he tends to view Austrophilia both as a very marginal political phenomenon, and as one that is inwardly focused only on how Germans were thinking about the domestic formation of the German Empire. So I don't remember him talking about actually Austrophilia in conjunction with the war aims of the First World War. I'll say that he doesn't. I didn't think that he captured the full breadth of Austrophilia, right? He wasn't noting a lot of the figures that I was able to find. So maybe it's a question of just the scope of the lens that he's looking at, where our disagreement is coming from. But I would also note that, you know, in policy debates, Austrophilia or reference to Austria-Hungary was only one argument that multinational imperialists could make. And in fact, they're looking at a whole variety of different things. They're looking at German federalism. They're looking at how Russia is governing its empire. They're looking at Polish political opinion, both in Prussia and in Congress Poland. And all of these different variants are circulating down into a wide range of arguments that they're presenting. So if Austrophilia wasn't necessarily the argument that was pushing or that was the breakthrough in policy discussions, it was Austrophiles or among multinational imperialists were incredibly influential, right? You know, Paul Rohrbach, very famously, their foreign policy bureaucrats, civil servants at the end of the war, who are grumbling that there's a Rohrbach circle or a Rohrbach Kreis within the German Foreign Office. So these guys are very influential in terms of policy. Austrophilia, whether or not it comes up at it doesn't tend to come up at roundtable discussions in the Chancellery, no. But it's one of these arguments that is in circulation in the public sphere, and is helped to articulate this multinational idea.
Thank you, Mark. I have at least two more questions. One from probably a German listener, Fritz Heinzen. And the question is, does your research note significant regional German differences towards Austro-Hungary? So that's the question about regional German differences. And the background to the question is, we are Rhinelanders, and I never heard any family predecessors obsess on the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. Of course, members of my family fought on the Western Front, and so their focus was always on combat in that direction.
I've tended to notice that these discourses come from all over the empire, actually. I haven't noticed any salient regional concentrations. I will say that there are hubs around which these discussions tend to happen, especially around universities. So the University of Freiburg is a hub. The Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in Berlin is a hub. So is the Friedrich Wilhelms Schlesische Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in Breslau is also another one of these hubs, and so are the universities or the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich. So it's coming from a variety of different areas. I haven't noticed any significant regional concentration, and that's another area where Vermeiren and I disagree. He thinks that this is primarily a South German phenomenon. I've found tons of North Germans who are interested in it. I will say there is a political concentration. These are ideas that tend to be espoused by progressive politicians of the Progressive People's Party, right? Left liberals, Catholics of the Center Party, and moderate conservatives. And the overlap seems to be that these are all parties that recognize that national identity is only one component that determines political loyalty, and that there's a series of other interests and identities that contribute to the legitimacy of the state. So for progressives, that's social identity. Their big thing is they want the empire to reinforce itself with social welfare programs. For Catholics, it's obvious. It's religion and regional identity. So there tends to be political concentrations. I haven't found regional ones.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I guess the book that you are preparing will be a response to some of these questions as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm using this as an opportunity to workshop an article because this is a part of a chapter that I have to cut from the book.
Wonderful. Dear audience, no pressure, yeah. but give us helpful questions. I have two more here in the pipeline. One from Mr. Babic. Thank you for the presentation. Already in 1878, many in German Austrian circles resented adding Slavic population to the fragile balance of power. How do World War I Austrian schemes they entertained, from annexing Serbia, toying with Kingdom of Poland, etc., play with German concerns of multi-ethnicity in Kaiserreich, obviously much lower share of non-German population?
Okay, sorry, I'm I'm processing the question. So these are questions that some authors go into, especially the ones who are interested about Mitteleuropa. Other ones neglect because they're interested in using Austria-Hungary as a sounding board for ideas of multi-ethnic organization. Mm-hmm. They are frankly, the specifics, the minutia of what Austria-Hungary is going to look like after the war is not something that I paid attention to in my research, just because it's not my research question. I think it's perfectly interesting, but it's not what I was focusing on. I'm interested in how Germany is thinking about the East. What I will say is in these discussions, usually it's not German nationalists that Austro-Germans, right, that imperial Germans, it's tough to say, the language gets very confusing. It's not Austro-Germans that imperial Germans are focused on. Rather, it's the Hungarian nobility or the government of the Kingdom of Hungary that they think of as the greater obstacle to reform, right? That this is a group of elites that is jealously guarding their unique privileged position within the empire and is reluctant to incorporate a Yugoslav, a Yugoslav or a Czech or a Polish constituent state. In terms, these conversations actually come up much more often, not in terms of Serbia, but in terms of Poland, right? Whether or not Austria is going to incorporate Poland. And here the Germans focus a little bit more because they're interested in how Congress, what the fate of Congress Poland is. And they say two ways of doing this, either incorporating Congress Poland into Cisleithania, just making it a larger part of the territories directly administered by Vienna, or they are contemplating Austro-trialism, right? A Austro-Hungarian Polish Empire. Mm-hmm. And in either case, they are adamantly opposed to this because they worry that Polish nationalists will have a considerably greater share either in the Reichsrat or decennial budget negotiations. And they're worried that this will allow Polish nationalists to foist irredentist foreign policy goals on Vienna and actually turn Vienna against Germany so that it can conquer the Prussian Polish-speaking territories. Sorry, that's a very long-winded question. It's kind of exploring what it's a very complicated question, but I hope I was able to shed some light on it.
Definitely. Thank you, Mark. So we have, let's say, 4 more minutes, and I have one more question. This is the last chance, dear audience, if you want to ask a question. And I will read this, for now, last question that we have, Mark. How well did the multinational empire idea coexist in the minds of these figures with Germany's overseas colonies? It's clearly not a problem for Rohrbach, but did any others prefer to turn away from overseas colonialism in favor of a European multinational empire?
No. Almost to a T, no, right. And who asked this question? It's a great question.
Even Morgan.
Hi, Stephen. It's good to hear from you. No, virtually none of these guys did. And the reason for this is that, quite frankly, they all understood, they all perceived the populations of sub-Saharan Africa as racially inferior. and as incapable of producing cultural achievements or innovations or sustaining politically sophisticated organizations. So they don't understand them as nations. They don't see any positive reason why they should be preserved, why their culture should be preserved, because they don't think they'll produce anything for humanity as a whole. And they also don't think that Germany has any compelling strategic reason to do it, because they don't think that they're politically sophisticated enough to offer serious forms of resistance to German dominance. So, I mean, it would be putting it crudely, but also accurately to say, like, no, because they were racists.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Since there are no further questions, Mark, what are open questions for you? I mean, you've done so much research and spent so much time. What are still open questions for you from a research perspective?
I would love to get deeper down into the nitty-gritty of how Polish populations are perceiving the German occupation of Congress Poland. We actually have pretty good records about how Prussian politicians are perceiving German imperialism, or Prussian Polish German populations are perceiving German imperialism. And contrary to popular belief, you know, they're more or less see this as inevitable, and also they're kind of comfortable with this multinational mode of expansion. I'd love to get down into the nitty-gritty of how Polish populations are perceiving this. Now, there's a problem of sourcing, right? Because a lot of these are peasant populations who don't leave a lot of records. There's been some studies, especially on Warsaw. I think Warsaw is actually kind of an exceptional state to look at. And I think some of these studies have some problems. So I'd like to look at other characteristic towns, but that takes a lot of archival research, and I'm not sure that'll make it into this book. Yeah,
don't overdo it, Mark. We are already impressed. And I end with a remark by Fritz Heinzen, who generously says, that's not a question mark. No need to take any notes. This was an excellent talk, and I definitely look forward to reading further of Dr. Kettler's work. And then he says, and Nanovic's timing was perfect, so that we can now watch the Germany-Switzerland soccer match. I think, Mark, we are at time. Thank you so much for a great lecture and a very gracious and detailed way of answering the questions. Our gratitude goes to the audience and your participation and your questions, of course. I'm also grateful to Connor and Jenny for the administrative, logistical, and technological support. I will just let you know that a week from now, the Nanovic Institute will host a virtual roundtable to look at Europe's refugee crisis 5 years after the fall of 2015. And a week after that, on October 27, we will host a virtual lecture by Professor Paluk on John Paul II's proposal for Europe. Stay tuned. Thank you again so much, Mark, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.